From USMB, this is the Christian Leader Podcast.
It's often claimed, just read through the Old Testament and God always seems to be violent. Well, it's in the Old Testament that we read things like the loving kindness of God never ceases, his mercies never come to an end, he's merciful to 1,000 generations. Like huge, wonderful claims about the unending mercy and faithfulness of God are drawn straight out of the Old Testament. So the idea that we can pit the old against the new and say, in the old, God is like this, but in the new, God is like this, it doesn't stand up at all.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to a new episode of the Christian Leader Podcast. My name is Matt Ayersman, and as always, so glad to have you with me. And the other voice you just heard was returning guest, Dr. Tim Geddert. Dr. Geddert is a retired New Testament professor over at Fresno Pacific University. He's a very accomplished author. He's been on the podcast before. I like to joke with Tim because he says he's retired, but he is not retired. This guy is as busy as ever, and Tim is just one of the sharpest minds in our denomination. He has a real gift of taking really big, complicated theological topics and communicating it in a way that people like you and I can understand. So today we're wrestling with something that I bet you've thought about. It's probably come up in your churches or in small group discussions: the violence of God. What do we do with the God of the Old Testament that seems to be so different from the loving Jesus that we see in the New Testament? If God never changes, why does he look so different in the Old Testament compared to the New? This is a huge, hard topic, and we probably won't solve it today, but honestly, I feel like Tim had some really helpful insight and just some really thoughtful framing that I think will be helpful for you, or also for anybody else in your church who might be wrestling with some of those questions. So this is a big, important topic, and honestly, one of my favorite guests. I'm so glad to have Tim back with us. So let's take a quick break here from this week's sponsor, and then let's dive in. We'll talk about the violence of the Old Testament with Dr. Tim Geddert.
Great news for the Central Valley and beyond. Fresno Pacific University has received a transformational $10 million Lilly Endowment Grant to equip and support today's church leaders, especially co-vocational pastors serving our communities. This investment expands seminary training, launches new programs, and provides vital scholarships for ministry students. And when you give toward the Lilly Matching Grant, your gift is matched, doubling your impact. Join us in strengthening the future of the church. Give today at fpu.edu/seminary.
All right, friends. Well, today we have a very important topic, a very interesting topic, and I try not to play favorites, but today's guest might be one of my favorites. We have a return guest. Honored to have Dr. Tim Geddert back with us. So Tim, thank you. You've been on several times now. Thanks for taking time to do this again. Always great to see you.
Glad to do it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes. And again, you've been on a few times, but if people haven't listened before, I know over the years, you've been very involved at Fresno Pacific. You've been very involved at the USMB and Mennonite World Conference. Can you just quickly catch us up what you're up to these days?
Okay, yeah, I was a full-time New Testament professor until 23. So about 3 years ago, I retired and didn't slow down too much. I just took on some different roles at Fresno Pacific on the board of directors and a few other things, a little bit of adjunct teaching. Picked up a significant assignment with Mennonite World Conference. So I'm chairing the Faith and Life Commission. And that's a pretty demanding role. There's a lot of challenges that we're working with, but it's a great opportunity to serve the global church, especially the global Anabaptist Mennonite world. So those are some of the bigger projects I'm working on. I preach in different churches and I keep working on writing projects as well. So life's good, life's busy.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think you're going to actually retire ever. I think you've got a lot of juice left. So that's good. That's good.
My kids have asked when they should plan the next retirement party. So
yes, that's awesome. Well, and scholastically or intellectually, you've done a lot of your careers focused on the book of Mark. I know you've got a book that's, I think, about to come out while we're recording. When it's out, when the podcast comes out, I think it'll already be out. So,
yep, that's the case. And my most recent book before this was on the Old Testament, the beginning of the story.
Yes.
So I guess I can't dodge the Old Testament questions that are hard to answer. So.
Well, yeah, that's what I was just going to say. So you're kind of known to be a New Testament scholar, and specifically Mark. But yeah, your last book was all about the Old Testament. So if people missed that one, I encourage you to go back to listen to that episode. And I don't want to rehash too much, but my big takeaway from that, Tim, was when it's important for us as kind of modern evangelical believers. One of the takeaways was we need to read the Old Testament with the New Testament in mind, right? So I guess as we start to talk about the Old Testament, can you just recap us just briefly about that, why that's important, and maybe there's the theology behind that?
Sure. I mean, in Jesus' day, there were people reading the Old Testament in a variety of different ways. So you had the Pharisees, and you had the scribes, and you had the Essenes, and they were interpreting their scriptures very diversely. So what do we as Christians do? Well, we watch to see how Jesus agreed and disagreed and often corrected and challenged. And so we need to learn to read the Old Testament the way that Jesus teaches us to do it. Otherwise, we end up committing the same errors that the Pharisees were making or other groups were making and so on. So as Jesus valued and read his Old Testament, so we also learn how to do that in the Jesus way, sometimes by watching how Jesus models it, sometimes by hearing what he explicitly says about the Old Testament, which he just called the scriptures. That was the only scriptures available to the Jews at the time. Mm-hmm. And so we learn from Jesus. Plus, the more we do that, the more we realize that the whole Old Testament was intended all along to be leading us towards Jesus, who is the middle of the story of God's redemptive work. Mm-hmm. So we read the Old Testament the way Jesus teaches us to. So I guess sometimes Old Testament interpretation requires New Testament expertise as well.
Yes, it's a whole book, isn't it?
Right.
So the main topic for today, and it's one that I think all of us have had to wrestle with at some point, is just the God of the Old Testament. And he appears to be very violent, very angry, very full of wrath. And we often hear this kind of claim that the God of the Old Testament doesn't seem to match up with the God of the New Testament. And why is that so? And that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks for people for Christianity. They can't really wrap their minds around Jesus when they also read the stories of the Old Testament. So I guess, can you just, what are we missing as kind of the introduction there? And over the years, I'm sure you've had people ask you that. Before we go too deep, do you have anything to add to just the overall idea of the topic there?
Sure. I mean, I used to say, well, go ask the Old Testament experts. I'm a New Testament scholar. I can't really say that anymore if I dare to write things about the Old Testament. On the other hand, I really think we need to be quite a bit clearer on what exactly we're claiming about the Old Testament before we just assume we know what the problem is. The word violence needs to be carefully examined. What exactly do we mean? We can talk about that somewhere along the way. It's often claimed, just read through the Old Testament and God always seems to be violent. Well, it's in the Old Testament that we read things like the loving kindness of God never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. He's merciful to 1,000 generations. Like huge, wonderful claims about the unending mercy and faithfulness of God are drawn straight out of the Old Testament. So the idea that we can pit the old against the new and say, in the old, God is like this, but in the new, God is like this, it doesn't stand up at all. The challenge of figuring out what to do with images of God that do seem violent or that we don't understand how to deal with, that challenge is there in the Old Testament. It's also there in the New Testament.
Right.
And then the confident, consistent, profound declarations of God's loving kindness and faithfulness and mercy and long-suffering, they're just as clearly present in the old as they are in the new. So pitting the old against the new is clearly not going to be the answer. Jesus didn't come to say, from now on, God is going to be different. He came to reveal what God is like, what God has always been like, what God always will be like. So that the problem of the violence of God in the Old Testament is the way we sometimes word it, but it's not a very accurate description of what the actual challenge is. So I would say as a starting point, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I think we often forget all of those passages, like you just mentioned, that talk about the mercy of God, the loving kindness of God throughout the Old Testament. And yeah, I think you're right that we forget about, there's at least, you can correct me, there's at least one instance in the New Testament in Acts where God kills two people on the spot in a way that seems a little bit more like the Old Testament God, right? Are there other, maybe remind us of that story and anything else? Are there other?
Sure. I mean, you're thinking of Ananias and Sapphira who were judged for, well, that's a good example of reading a story in a larger context. They were judged for way more than just not quite telling the whole truth. They were judged for way more than just being selfish and hoarding some of what they pretended to give away. It was a really major paradigm shift that they were trying to bring into the church. They were trying to create a concept of church that was based on the love and kindness of God, not just the self-sacrificial, hoarding some of what they pretended to give away. It was a really major paradigm shift that they were trying to bring into the church. They were trying to create a concept of church that was based on the love and kindness of God, not just the self-sacrificial, hoarding some of what they pretended to give away. It was a really major paradigm shift that they were trying to bring into the church. They were trying to create a concept of church that would mirror the whole Roman Empire, where you have benefactors and then people who receive benefaction and then owe things in return. Like the whole story read in context it was a serious attempt to reshape what the church was going to be like. So there was a big issue at stake. But you're right. It's a very swift and decisive act of judgment on God's part that puts a halt to that. And some people would say, well, that's the God of the Old Testament all over again. Well, the fact is that in the Old Testament, God is often incredibly merciful to evildoers, like, for example, King David.
Right.
King David was a murderer. He was an adulterer. And yet God and David writes about the loving kindness and the mercy of God. And the next time judgment seems to fall swiftly. So the problem is there in both testaments, and we need to wrestle with them. And that doesn't mean we have easy answers.
Yes. Well, yeah, there's going to be a lot of wrestling in our conversation today, I think. But one thing you just said a minute ago, I think is important for us to come back to is just defining violence. So maybe before we get too far, you mentioned that. Can you just spell that out for us?
So I was thinking about, how we're the ones who are using this word. We're saying God seems to be a violent God. Well, whatever we mean by violence is what we mean when we make the statement. Okay. Right. But if we stop and think, what exactly do I mean by a statement like that? So here are some possibilities. If we mean getting involved in a situation in a way that's painful, that isn't pleasant at all, well, dentists are violent every time you go.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
But we would never use the word violence for what a dentist does, because we see, well, there's a higher purpose. It's for the good of the patient. So if violence means doing something that hurts someone, then we have to stop and say, for what purpose, in what context, by whom? Is it wished or unwished? Is it that's not a good enough definition. Okay.
Right.
So you say, well, what if violence means just aggressive action, just working aggressively in a way that sort of physically attacks someone? Just watch a hockey game. Watch World Cup soccer, for that matter. Watch football. It's part of the game. It's how you play the game.
Right.
If that's not violence, then we need another definition of violence.
Mm-hmm.
If it's imposing your will on somebody, well, parents do it, teachers do it, police officers do it, prison guards do it, imposing. So none of these apparently are good enough definitions, because there's all sorts of situations where these things happen, where it's good and it's right and it's necessary. So what if we add the word inappropriate? Inappropriate use of violent force.
Okay.
Well, then God never is violent by definition. God's actions are never inappropriate, because God's always the standard of what is appropriate. So everything God does is by definition the appropriate thing to do, because it's an act of God. So we can't add the word inappropriate to our definition without denying that God is violent. So what are we left with? Well, I think what we're left with is we have situations where what happens seems to be attributed to God, seems to be inappropriate. But since we know that that's not possible, it can't be inappropriate if it's God doing, we don't know what to do with it. And so now we have this dilemma. What are we going to do with this kind of a text where something is being done that seems to be God's doing, seems to be inappropriate, but we know God doesn't do inappropriate things, and now we have a problem. So I think maybe our starting point should be that it's a dilemma. It's not just a difficult question. I mean, there's lots of difficult questions, but this one's a dilemma. We don't know how to understand the word violence in a way that actually fits the data. We can clearly see lots of violence in the world that fits that paradigm. Humans use force and violence inappropriately on each other over and over and over again. And sometimes it's deadly force. Sometimes inappropriate use of violent force happens all the time. Ever by God.
Yeah.
And that's I think a starting point for figuring out what to do with this, because there are theologies, there are people who would want to attribute everything to God. If it happened, if somehow been God's will, this act of violent evil, I mean, everything turns out for our good somehow, so God must have somehow willed it. Once we start attributing to God the things that really are evil, now we've abandoned our starting point that God is the standard of judgment on what is right and what is wrong. And God's acts never are inappropriate use of violence. So
Yeah.
That's my starting point. My starting point is that this is an almost intractable problem. And so the best progress we can make is to talk about what is the nature of God really like? What uses of force seem to be consistent with the way God works? Fruitful things to explore. Which acts of aggressive force do we not have the right to use because they're only God's prerogative? Like, I think that, God seems to be meting out justice, so we should mete out justice too. Well, there are lots of scriptures that actually say that we leave that to God, who sees the heart. God knows the intentions. God knows the heart. God knows all the circumstances. God may very well mete out judgment appropriately. Wouldn't and couldn't, because we don't know the whole story. So we learn what justice is from viewing how God acts justly, but that doesn't automatically give us the right to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's just it's a really huge problem, and I'm never going to claim that I have all the answers. If this podcast helps us think better about how to avoid some pitfalls along the way, how to gain whatever wisdom we can. But I mean, if I thought really that in a 45-minute podcast I could solve the problem, well, why am I writing books on Mark? I should be writing books on this. The best minds have wrestled with this throughout history.
Yes, it's a big problem. And I guess it is a problem. And you just outlined a lot of things I want to follow up on. Like, there's a lot of, I think, just cultural, historical things that modern Americans don't understand. And then another thing that I've heard, I think I maybe even heard this from you, is that sometimes we assume that if something's in the Bible, that means that God wanted it to happen, or that God chose, he wanted those things to happen. And I think I heard you say that sometimes, well, the violence that we attribute to God is actually just human violence that just happened to be characters in the Bible. So can you give us an example of a time, something that's in the Bible that seems violent, that maybe wasn't actually God's doing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the whole reason why Israel wanted a king against God's intentions and against God's wisdom for what would have served their real needs was so that they could have someone to lead them into battle. And the prophet warned Israel, if you insist on having a king, and if God in fact gives in to your insistence on having a king, he will create bigger armies, he will enslave people, he will have a harem, he will be self-serving, and he will lead you into battle. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. And lots of the military action that occurred in the time of the monarchy was never attributed to God in the scriptures. There are earlier texts where God delivers Israel from Egypt, where God is the initiator. This is not a bunch of slaves who have a great strategy for escape. This is God intervening. You see God protecting Israel and using Israel often in counter strategic ways, putting a torch in a clay pot and waving it in the air and blowing trumpets is not a usual strategy for defeating an army, but that's what God did through Gideon. So you have stories of God's interventions to rescue and protect Israel that are very different from the ones later on, where Israel goes out and attacks neighboring nations and builds this enormous empire in the time of Solomon and so on. And then later on, when God does use armies to fulfill God's purpose, sometimes it's foreign armies to bring judgment on Israel. So yes, according to the Old Testament portraits of God, God will at times use military action for the furthering of God's purposes for the people of God. And here's one of the places, I know this is going beyond your question, but this is where we have to make some distinctions between the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, God's strategy for preserving the people of God was to keep it within one people group, which ultimately became one nation in one geographical area. So Israel was the covenant people of God. Either Israel as a people group, Israel as a nation was the context in which God established a covenant. So if you were not Israelite and you wanted to get in on the covenant, how did you do it? Well, you joined Israel. That's how you did it. It was one context for the purpose of salvation going to the whole world, like the other story of Jonah being sent to Nineveh, and so on. Like the whole purpose of Israel is for the sake of the whole world. But the context of God's salvation acts in the Old Testament were within Israel. Well, all that changed when the early church was sent out into all the world to plant churches in every tribe, every nation, every culture. And God no longer chooses one nation on this earth to be the center of God's work. And therefore, God, by necessity, needs to preserve this one nation, this one people group, because otherwise the people of God are in jeopardy. That's not the way God does things anymore. Not Israel, not America, not the European Western world. It's the people of God scattered among all the nations, which is now the locus of God's redemption. So things changed. And so I think there's some biblical arguments for God using the strategy of national military protection in the Old Testament that no longer apply in the New Testament.
Okay.
Now, that brings us to another huge important issue, and that is, as we all know, if we're Mennonite or Mennonite brethren, we all know that within our tradition there's been a strong tendency towards what we've often called pacifism, so not supporting military action or participation in the military. And there have always been counter voices, people among us who are not of this persuasion, and as US NBs probably were 50-50 on the question. Some people would say, well, the problem is the violence of God in the Old Testament. If you're a pacifist, then you don't know what to do with that because not the kind of God you worship. But if you believe in the just war theory, well, then there's no problem. That does not solve the problem, unfortunately, because the just war theory applied to the military battles in the Old Testament is not relevant. Like nobody in the Old Testament looked at Christian theologians to see what are the 5 criteria for a just war and then established ground rules for whether or not Israel should or shouldn't attack Jericho. Like, you can't defend pacifism by using the Old Testament military texts, and you can't defend the just war theory by using those texts either. Like, it's a problem for everybody's view of how Christians should or shouldn't be involved in military engagement in the contemporary world. So, I just don't accept that this is a pacifist's problem or something like that. It's a biblical challenge to understand how that works.
I think the whole, like the example of Israel and just how the world worked kind of as nation states historically, is that the answer, one of the answers for like you just mentioned, Jericho, the genocide of the Canaanites? Is that kind of part of the rationale there, is that at the time it wasn't nearly as individualistic of a culture as we are now? So like individual people didn't view themselves as individuals, maybe even individual nations. They saw themselves as part of a larger group, right? Is that part of the rationale of some of the genocide?
I think it's part of it. I don't think it doesn't seem to solve the problem very well, especially to an individualistic thinking Western contemporary person.
Right.
Just because they treated families as families doesn't seem to make it any more legitimate to kill off man, woman, and child for the sin of the father, in case of Abraham, for example. It still feels unfair, but you're right that in their world, they would often think much more in collective terms. And so it's Israel attacking a warrior neighboring enemy. There's going to be casualties of war on both sides who aren't actively engaged in the battle. Like, they just didn't have protocols for when it is or isn't okay to jeopardize the lives of innocent non-military people. Like, the Geneva Convention on War didn't exist. I mean, they just lived a different kind of world. And in some ways, their world was way more violent. In some ways, it was less, because we now have the ability to fire missiles across the globe and blow up whole cities at one time, which they didn't. In terms of how many engagements in battle there were, I mean, neighboring nations were always fighting each other for territory and for resources and for protection and so on. So in some ways, it was a more violent world. Also, in their world, most of the people groups had what they thought of as their own local tribal god. So most of them would have believed that there are gods all over the place, multiple gods. Polytheism was widespread. But our God is the one that we worship, and we are the ones who need to stand up for our God, and our God needs to stand up for us. And so when we attack a neighboring nation, it's not only us imposing our will on them, it's our God defeating their God.
Right.
And Israel was often tempted to view God, the real God, the one true God, creator of heaven and earth, as if he was Israel's God who needed to prove that Israel's God is better than someone else's God. And that's when the prophets would react and say that God is a God of justice, and God is a God whose sphere of influence is the whole world, because God is the creator of heaven and earth. And so God's prerogative is to rule the nations. And Israel, I think, would often misunderstand that and think that, this is our God who needs to prove that he's the right one and all the others are the wrong ones. And so our God defends his honor among the nations by us killing our enemies. That was very frequently the opposite of what the prophetic message was. God's fame across the globe will be recognized through the faithfulness of God's people and through God's mercy and through God's generosity and so on and so on. So yes, there's violence, but some of the ways in which Israel understood the function of military engagement just made it harder.
Yeah.
Bear proper witness to the nature of the one true God.
Is there anything else historically or culturally that was going on at that time that would have made some of this make more sense to people at that time that just doesn't make sense to us today? Like, are there other examples of that you can spell out for us?
I mean, what comes to mind is that every group in the ancient world had their own idea about how the world came into existence. Creation myths. The Babylonians had a creation myth, and most of them involved violent defeat of alternative gods and enemies, and then the one hero or the one superior god would emerge as victorious and use the body parts of the defeated gods as the building blocks to create a world, and so on and so on. So there were lots of violent creation stories floating around the Canaanite world or the ancient world. And the Genesis story is an alternative story. It's God did not create by blasting to bits all his enemies. God created by a word. God created by making things good. In fact, the beasts were not the problem. The beasts were God's creation. Stars didn't rule the world. God created the stars. So it's kind of like an alternative true story over against violent stories of the neighboring nations. So if anything, Genesis 1 and 2 talk about a peaceful God using peaceful means to create a good world.
Order out of the chaos. Right. Yeah.
And then violence comes in when both humans and God's own supernatural enemies choose to turn against the ways of the one true good God, and then a violent world. And in this violent world, God does, according to the way the stories are told, sometimes use just, but what we would often think of as violent countermeasures to judge and to restore and to save. And I think sometimes we just have to also admit that the stories that are told are stories that had a meaning and a purpose and a function and a lesson that we may no longer easily capture because there's different circumstances in a different world. God doesn't change. If God is like Jesus, then God has always been like Jesus, and God always will be like Jesus. But God's strategies for restoring creation have changed over and over and over again. Like how God brought about conviction and salvation in one era was not always the same as in another era. You think of the flood, you think of the creation of Israel, you think of the exile. And then, of course, with the coming of Jesus and with his substitutionary death on the cross, I mean, these are God's strategic actions to bring about the salvation that has always been God's goal. God doesn't change, but God's means of engagement often change, and God will deal with me differently than he'll deal with you in our circumstances, precisely because God doesn't change. God's faithfulness endures for every individual in all their unique circumstances.
I think that's really interesting. I guess I kind of knew that, but I haven't really thought about it in the words you just said, that God doesn't change, but his strategies do. So is this, again, this is complicated. There's not a simple answer, but at some points, do you feel like in human history, the world was evil and violent, so God chose a strategy that would work at that time versus other times? Or can you just expand on that idea of the strategy changing a little bit? I really like that.
I mean, I think the whole world has always been, since the fall, a place of violence and misuse of power and injustice and so on. And God is always at work.
Mm-hmm.
But the way the story is told, you just can't wipe out of the story engagement that is judgmental as well, where the old language was the cup of iniquity is finally full and God meets judgment. It's part of the story. And I've used the word story a lot, so maybe I need to say that too. I think
sure. Yeah, sure.
First of all, story doesn't mean fiction. Some
Right.
people hear the word story and just assume, well, this is all made up and this is just a story. No, this is a true story of how God has been at work in the world. But a true story is still told in the form of the story. And when stories are told, the appropriate question to ask is, what is the lesson to be learned from this story? In other words, what am I supposed to learn from the fact that these events were told in precisely this way? The nature of the retelling of the events is the story. And so what does the story teach us? A good way to use an example is to go to the parables of Jesus and say, many of them at least are stories. The appropriate thing to do is to say, why would Jesus tell a story like this? And what is the lesson I'm supposed to learn from the story? And it's really easy to hear the story and learn completely wrong lessons because we're missing the point. That's not the point of the story. So read the parable of the weeds in the field, and we think Jesus is teaching us the right way to keep a garden. He had absolutely no intention to teach farming protocols or gardening. He wanted to teach something about God's patient endurance, but also waiting, and that we should leave judgment in the hands of God, and that God defers judgment until the end. And therefore, we need to be side by side with those who don't yet follow Jesus. So that's the lesson in the story, and everything else about the story is just there so we learn the appropriate lesson. Well, the same for all the other stories. Like, why would Luke tell the story of the visit of the shepherds to the manger in precisely the way that he did? Why would he use the language that he did? Why would he, because the story teaches a set of lessons. So the entire Old Testament, every story in which there's some violent event that happens is told a certain way so that we as readers will try to discern what is the lesson I'm supposed to learn from this story. If we would approach all of Scripture primarily as a record of God's strategies to bring about God's ultimate purposes for the salvation of the world, each part is presented to us in a certain way to learn certain stories, we would be guarded against a lot of things that go wrong when we use it in other ways. Like we Bible into an encyclopedia of historical factuality. Well, of course, there's historical facts all over the place, but it's not that kind of book.
Right.
We turn it into a theology book where all the topics are dealt with in a hugely scattered way. And so if we want to know the nature of God, we have to find 57 verses scattered all over the Bible and bring it back into correct order. So we now have finally a correct portrait of God. Like, it's a pretty strange theology book, if that's what it is. Or it's a strange ethics book, if that's what it is. Once we recognize what it actually is, it's the story of God's redemptive acts. Then we can learn theology along the way. We can learn ethics along the way. We can learn history. Learn them best by asking in each text, why was this text included? Why was it reported the way it was? What's the lesson I'm supposed to learn here? I think that helps us. It might not answer all of our questions, but maybe our questions aren't the ones that it was designed to answer.
Yeah.
It's where we need humility.
Well, I think you just said that we need to kind of look at them instance by instance. So like, for example, the story of Achan, or we could take the flood, or we could take any of those stories that are kind of hard for us to understand. Would you say, like, do each of those quote unquote violent acts have a specific lesson, or like, does the violence of the Old Testament as a whole, is that supposed to teach us a lesson about like holiness or something like that? Is it case by case, or the whole?
I think there's some of both. And in both cases, we have to be humble enough to say, this is to the best of our ability, the interpretation that we think we're drawn to. But here's the next thing. All provisional as it leads toward Jesus. Like, Theologians have always used the language of progressive revelation. There's only so much revealed at an earlier stage, and then the storyline becomes clearer. The portraits of God become more and more recognizable, or more and more helpfully revealing as we move through the story, until Jesus comes along, leads it several steps forward. Is the primary. So when Jesus came along, he valued the Old Testament. He viewed the Old Testament as authoritative. He dismissed it as inspired. But that didn't stop him from saying, in the Old Testament, it says that we should do this, but now I say to you, it's not going to be that way any longer. From now on, it's going to be like this. So, for example, the most obvious example is in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is critiquing the way the Old Testament was being interpreted by his contemporaries. You have was said, but I say to you. But then suddenly in the middle of it, he doesn't critique the way they misinterpret it. He sets aside what the Old Testament itself taught. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, and then he moves beyond that kind of ethic of retribution. So from now on, we're not going to pay back in kind. From now on, we're going to absorb evil. We're going to find creative, nonviolent ways to, if possible, bring evildoers to their senses. If not, then we suffer unjustly as a witness to our faithfulness, the way Jesus himself did. So not everything in the Old Testament continues to apply. And then the early church practiced that. When you get to Acts 15 and they said, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles joining the church? And they basically said, well, we're not going to impose on them all the Old Testament requirements. Like food laws, Sabbath, the circumcision, the way things needed to be. So I think that even there we say, okay, in the Old Testament, we have what we think of as problem texts, because we're not quite sure how they reveal the true character of God. We also ask, now that Jesus has revealed more about how God is, but also has always been, we now learn something about how things might have been necessary then, in their context, in their world, but are no longer the way God wants God's people to act. Violent action in defense of a nation. Lots more sense in the Old Testament, where the nation itself had to be preserved in order for the covenant people to survive. Then it makes sense today, where God's people are scattered in every nation. And every time we use violent action to defend our nation, we're fighting someone who's using violent action to defend their nation. Christians killing Christians. And I know that there are not easy answers, and I recognize that great theologians have been on different sides of that debate. But things have changed. Things are not the same now that Jesus has established many new things. And so what looked sort of indefensible in the old actually have been defensible in that context, but not necessarily the appropriate action for today.
Well, I think that's so crucial. I want to take a minute to maybe unpack that a little bit further. Can we talk a little bit more about Jesus, how things changed with Jesus, progressive revelation? You have heard it said this, but I say this. Like we say that God doesn't change, but Jesus clearly changed everything. So can you just unpack that a little bit more about God doesn't change, but Jesus did change everything? Can you just dive a little bit deeper? Keep that going.
Because of what Jesus revealed and because of what Jesus did, both on the cross and through the resurrection and through his example and through his teaching, he can now expect followers subsequent to the resurrection, who are now filled with the Holy Spirit, behave in ways that it wasn't even realistic to expect saints of old to fully practice. In other words, there's a higher expectation for followers of Jesus today than there would have been for the sons of Noah, for that matter, the sons of Abraham or daughters. So Jesus has brought forward to a next stage, the redemptive work of God, and therefore followers of Jesus are held to what I would call a higher standard, clearer recognition of the true nature of God's intentions and God's work in the world. But because the New Testament also contains texts where God seems to intervene rather aggressively, you use the example, Ananias and Sapphira,
Yep.
Doesn't mean that now the problem is solved. It's an Old Testament problem, but we've got it all figured out now. We just follow Jesus. It isn't that simple, and we know it isn't. And so we wrestle with it, I think, in both testaments.
Yeah, definitely. A couple kind of practical things I want to make sure we make some time for people who attend church and they love Jesus, they love their church, they haven't done the scholarly work that you've done. I think for a lot of these instances, there might be a rational explanation. There might be something, again, like a historical thing that makes sense. So we can kind of explain some of these problem passages. I think a lot of people just get stuck on the emotion of it, that there were innocent women and children who were killed in the Old Testament. And even if there might be an explanation that we could work our way around, that's still just a hard pill for people to swallow. So if you were to kind of put your pastor hat on for a minute, and if someone's just reading their Bible devotionally and they just can't get over the emotional hang up of that, how do you kind of counsel people through those?
Yeah, okay. I guess it depends who exactly it is that's sitting in front of me and their question is and what their need is and so on. I'm going to start a little more theological first, and then I'll come to your question.
Love it.
So I think that I always want people to perceive my true conviction that the Bible is a reliable authority for faith and life. That's what I believe, even when I don't know what to do with some texts. And the reason I believe it is not because I see how it works all the time, but because Jesus teaches us to treat it that way. And so the Bible is an authoritative text, but it's not our highest authority. Jesus never said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, and I'm going to give it to the books that you write.
The Bible. Yeah, right.
The highest authority is never the Bible. The highest authority is the one to whom the Bible points. It's Jesus. It's the God, the creator of heaven and earth, is the highest authority. And his authority, God's authority, is exercised in many ways, but in part also through Scripture. So ultimately, God matters more. And if I have to say, I don't know what to do with this text, it's because I don't ever want to impugn the nature of God. God is a loving, faithful, good God. Text makes me believe that God is a capricious, violent, lacking self-control God that you can't trust. That's what the text makes me believe.
Right.
That's what I feel. Something is going wrong here. Either I'm misinterpreting the text, or what I'm attributing to God is actually not attributable to God. This is what humans did.
Right.
Or maybe this is a text in which we're not intended to say, this is what God is like, but this is what somebody thought God was like. Okay? Like something is going wrong.
Yeah.
The one conclusion I will never reach is, I guess God really is a violent, impetuous God who loses his temper and doesn't control his emotions, and his mercy is limited and his justice is limited as well. Like, I can't ever do that. Now, moving towards the pastoral response, always want people to hear loud and clear what the Old Testament itself affirms, and that is that one day God's justice will be revealed. God is a just God. In the end, when the whole story is told, we will be able to recognize that God is a loving, faithful, generous, just God. Well, once you've said that, you have to believe that something beyond this human life is part of our full story, because there's just no possible way that anybody can believe that every person who's ever lived on the face of this earth has got a fair shake out of this life. It's not possible. There have been people who've experienced almost nothing but tragedy and died a violent, unjust death. It's the only story. That's their story. Then God's justice is not revealed. But if there's more to the story that we don't understand, there's more to this story, but there's another life beyond this life in which we can make right all the wrongs of this world. That leaves us with tons of unanswered questions. We like to think we know exactly what's going to happen. We all die and then we all go to heaven or hell and it's all over. And I say, God has not revealed a lot of the details about how ultimately, once this life is over, God is not yet finished with us. And God is a God who makes things good and right and faithful and true. If God turned around the incredible injustice of the cross of Jesus through the resurrection, we need to trust God to turn around all the injustices of the life stories of so many people for whom life has not given them a fair shake.
Right.
In the end, God's justice will be revealed. And I don't know how that works.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to give up my conviction that we trust a loving, faithful God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good, Tim. I really appreciate that. Well, as we begin to wrap up, I kind of want, again, kind of end with a kind of bigger umbrella question. So I know there have been some kind of high-profile pastors and leaders who have kind of said, oh, we don't really need the Old Testament anymore. We only need to preach the New Testament. Or some people might avoid reading the Old Testament because they feel uncomfortable. They don't understand. There's a kind of a tendency to focus on the New Testament. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine you would say it's good for us to read the Old Testament. It's good for us to wrestle with these things. So I guess maybe for pastors and lay people, just everyday Christians, why is it important for us to keep reading the Old Testament? And what do you want us to remember as we read the Old Testament, especially if we come across something that's difficult?
Right. So I would say probably because we are followers of Jesus, starting in the New is usually maybe I should say a safer place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Would be less likely to reach a whole bunch of provisionally wrong interpretations if you start with the New.
Yes.
There's a lens through which to read the Old. But yes, we
Right.
should read the Old because Jesus teaches us to, and because
Mm-hmm.
every writer of the New Testament quotes it. Almost all of them quote it. They all refer to it. So the Old Testament, if you're reading the Old Testament, I would say the most important thing is to read it as a story. It's the story of God's redemption. It's not the story of God losing his temper.
Mm.
It's not the story of God saying, oh, okay, enough's enough. I'm just going to blast this people to smithereens because I can't deal with them anymore. That's not what it's designed to do. It's designed to teach us how God has always been at work bringing about the salvation of the world. If we have a lens like that, then we'll notice which are the hard texts.
Mm-hmm.
How in the world does this text fit that narrative? And that's then the problem. So at that point, I would say, if you encounter those troubling texts, God never, ever intended for every individual Christian to figure it all out on their own. That's a contemporary Western modern idea that if it's in the Bible, I should be able to figure it out on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of church history, Bible interpretation was always a communal affair, if for no other reason than it's because most people didn't have a Bible that they could read.
Right.
And it's always been assumed that when God's people get together, there's going to be teachers among them. There's going to be learning together. And so I think that if you run into a pastor that you don't know what to do with, just say, that's one that I'm going to ask my pastor about, or my Sunday school teacher, or I'm going to see if I can find something helpful online or whatever. Like, don't assume you're always going to be able to figure it out. It's just not an assumption we should ever make. If it just continues to be a troubling passage, I guess I say our life is mostly shaped by what we do understand, not by what, and we need to go back to what is clear in Scripture. And if the Old Testament becomes too difficult, go to the places that aren't as difficult. Go to the Psalms. Read through the prophets. They have so many messages of hope. And I think when you do, you'll also discover that in the Old Testament, you sometimes have texts that seem to push in one direction, but then you get to the prophets and they say, yeah, but there's a bigger story. This is what God's going to do. And the prophets seem to recognize that there are tough situations in our past, but look what God has planned that's up ahead. And that'll send you back to the New Testament. And I don't know if that's helpful, but certainly if I were a preacher who encountered a really tough text, I would just say this might not be the right text to preach this Sunday until I want better handles on it.
Yeah, more clarity.
There are some good books that help deal with it. C.S. Lewis has written a famous book called The Problem of Pain, where he wrestles the whole justice of God question. Christopher Wright wrote a book, The God I Don't Understand, and he has there on the violence of God in the Old Testament. So if we're truly wrestling, we need to be willing to do our homework and read some good resources.
That's good, Tim. I think that's really, really good. We're already over time, but I know you had a lot of notes, a lot of preparation. What did I not ask you that you want to tack on here at the end?
Man, I'd have to go through all my notes. what the main ones are. But yeah, I think you've covered it. I mean,
Okay,
I
enough.
If I gave the impression I've got this all figured out and there are no problem texts for me, then I miscommunicated. I want everyone who hears this podcast to say, these are some of the ways that I've tried to wrestle with some challenging questions, and the challenging questions still remain. But this one thing I am sure of: God is a good God. God is a just God. God is a merciful God. When I don't understand, then it's because I have failed to grasp the fullness of what God may yet want to reveal or will one day reveal to us when the story is completed.
Yes. Well, if I can add on one more book recommendation, I think people should check out The Beginning of the Story by Dr. Tim Geddert, and also go back and listen to the podcast episode. We walked through a few of those hard questions last time you were on, Tim. So if you missed that, go back and listen to that. But Dr. Geddert, I am just every time I talk to you, I'm so honored. And I've heard people say you're one of the sharpest minds in MB land, and I totally agree. You make difficult things really easy to grasp and wrestle with. So thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for giving me more and more difficult things. So
yeah, next up, we're going to go even harder next time. So
wow. All right.
Thanks for your time, Tim.
You bet. Thanks a lot.
Looking to grow as a leader? You don't have to do it alone. USMB cohorts are free online communities where people from all walks of life, pastors, ministry leaders, volunteers, and anyone who wants to grow, gather to learn, ask questions, share ideas, and encourage one another. Whether you're passionate about discipleship, youth ministry, spiritual formation, or simply connecting with others, there's a cohort for you. Each cohort meets online, making it easy to invest in your growth wherever you serve. Best of all, they're free. Registration is open now. Find the cohort that's right for you at usmb.org/cohorts and join a community that's growing together in Christ.
Well, one more time, many thanks to our friend, Dr. Tim Geddert. He somehow makes these things that are difficult and heavy and hard to understand fun and enjoyable, right? I love learning under people like Dr. Tim Geddert. So, Tim, thanks again for sharing your expertise and your insight with us today. Not just giving pat kind of easy answers, but wrestling with us and helping us know how to wrestle. So grateful for leaders and teachers like that. So thank you, Tim. One more time, in previous episodes, we have talked to Tim before about some of those kind of difficult passages from the Old Testament. So if you want a little bit more of a deeper dive, you can search our archives and find those episodes. Or you can also check out his book, The Beginning of the Story, which is all about the Old Testament. And if you enjoyed this episode, I don't want to give too much away, but keep listening. We might just hear from Dr. Tim again before too much longer. So stay tuned. There might be more of this coming your way. But for now, thanks again for making us part of your day, part of your week. So grateful to have you tune in. So thanks for being here. Have a great week ahead, and I'll look forward to catching you next time right here on the Christian Leader Podcast.